Okay, so now I would like to ask our mayor, Richard Bailey, to come on up and introduce our speaker today.
Well, good afternoon, Rotarians and guests. Today it's my honor to introduce today's speaker, the mayor of the city of Imperial Beach, Paloma Aguirre. Mayor Aguirre's personal story is inspirational, and it includes being the first person in her family to graduate college. Her work in the community was recognized in 2014 when she was named Woman of the Year by the state legislature. And in 2018, she began her service on the city council. Most recently, she was elected as IB's mayor, replacing beloved outgoing mayor, Mayor Sewage, who is a frequent guest of this club. And also, she was appointed to the California Coastal Commission. Mayor Aguirre is going to share some of her priorities for the city of Imperial Beach, and one of those priorities is something that's near and dear to all of our hearts here, and that's clean water and addressing the ongoing cross-border sewage issue. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to our colleague from the South, Mayor of Imperial Beach, Paloma Aguirre.
Thank you so much for having me today, President Nguyen. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you, Mayor Bailey. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I also want to thank you all for supporting the Imperial Beach Neighborhood Center Pantry. That's a big issue for us, so thank you so much for that. So today, I forgot to grab my clicker. There it is. Okay. So today I just want to talk a little bit about my journey to office, and then I'm going to cover a little bit about the background on the sewage crisis, and then I'm going to give you an update on where we are on that issue. So a little bit about myself. As Mayor Bailey mentioned, I'm the first person in my family to graduate college. I was born in San Francisco, and my parents wanted to raise us back in Mexico, so around the age of 8, they took us back. And I always wanted to come back and go to school here and compete in surfing. I'm an avid surfer. And so in 2001, I had a couple of friends that were bodyboarding in Imperial Beach and said that it has the best wave in the world. I'm like, well, I have to see it to believe it. So in 2001, I hopped on a plane and moved to Imperial Beach and surfed it and just fell in love with it. I fell in love with its waves, with its people, and never wanted to leave. So fast forward a little bit, I was going to school at USD, and I was coming out of the water, and I saw a guy putting up signs that read, "Clean water now." I said, "What are you doing? What does that mean?" And he said, "Don't you know you surf the most polluted beach in America?" I honestly had no idea. I had been surfing for at least 3 years, I think. And that guy happened to be Serge Dedina, or my predecessor. So at the time he still is, executive director of Wild Coast. So he said, "You know what, you should come and volunteer for us." So the next Monday I showed up with my resume, and the rest is history. My career in conservation began then. So I worked for Wild Coast for almost 15 years. In the meantime, I decided to go to grad school. So I went to Scripps Institution of Oceanography and obtained a master's in marine biodiversity and conservation. And through that program, I was selected to go work in U.S. Congress for U.S. Senator Cory Booker. So I helped him, assist him in his Environment and Public Works Committee work and the Ocean Subcommittee work. And then in 2017, while I was in DC, we had the largest sewage spill in our region ever recorded. And it was one of those aha moments that I said, what am I doing in DC? I really need to go back to my community and do as much as I can. So I came back that year, and in 2018, I decided to run for office. I had seen the progress that Mayor Dedina was making, so I decided to run for office and was successful. I came in first place as a council member at large for the city of Imperial Beach. So since then, this issue is not a new issue. The sewage crisis has been ongoing for over 2 decades. I just wanted to point out a little bit of the geography of the region. As you all well know, we have the Tijuana estuary at the south of us, the San Diego Bay to the north, and the city of Imperial Beach in the middle. Obviously, Imperial Beach is the most southwesterly city in the continental U.S., and we have the city of Coronado to the north, and the city of Tijuana to the south. And as you can see, the urban encroachment there is quite dense of the city of Tijuana. But the reason why we have a sewage crisis is because the shared nature of the watershed. The Tijuana River watershed is about 1,800 square miles. It has 3/4 in the US and 1/4 in Mexico. But despite having a small portion of it in Mexico, the impacts are very, very great. Why? Because the city of Tijuana has insufficient sewage infrastructure. And on top of that, they have a combined stormwater and sewage infrastructure system. So every time it rains, we have these significant collapses in the infrastructure in Tijuana that can cause sewage spills. Also, the other important thing to point out here is that we have a lot of recreational spaces. We have Borderfield State Parks, which is just at the border. We have the Tijuana River Valley Regional County Park, which is one of the only green space areas that are provided in the South Bay. We have, as you all know, organic farms and equestrian stables that provide a different type of recreation to the community. And that's just a picture of how close Playas de Tijuana is. And this will be important when I start explaining the sewage spills. So the challenges of that shared nature of the watershed, as I mentioned, are pretty vast. And they're not just related to water quality, but they're also related to solid waste, excess sediment input that pretty much blanket all the trails that we have in the regional park available to recreate. This is a picture of Effie Mace Trail. Has anybody ever gone to the trails and done hiking or biking? One or two folks. They're pretty beautiful trails. They're almost 23 miles of connecting trails. But unfortunately, this is the reality every year. Every time it rains, all of that uncollected waste, trash, tires, car parts, refrigerators, you name it, it all washes down into the Tijuana River Valley, and then what doesn't get stuck in the vegetation flows out to sea. And as you can see in the background, Tijuana is about, in elevation from the sea level, is about 300 feet above sea level. So it's just, gravity. Everything that rains in Tijuana, it all becomes captured and then flows down the river stream. So this is just a quick photo of a trash capture device that's located at Borderfield State Park. It's a net, basically a floating net, that is intended to capture that solid waste before it flows out to sea. The sediment capture basins are the size of, they're the size of 2 football fields. And those are intended to capture excess sediment. And what is sediment? It's just silty, very fine particulate matter that is very, it can severely impact the wetlands downstream. It could asphyxiate them and destroy them. So they had to put these sediment capture basins that cost state parks about $1.5 million every year to extract that excess sediment and remove it and place it somewhere else. So and that's why I mentioned, because this is an issue that impacts everybody in the region, right? State parks, they have to spend almost 80% of their annual budget cleaning out these sediment capture basins because of these threats to the ecosystem. But of most importance to us all, of course, is the sewage crisis that affects us. This is a picture of the river mouth, obviously. The river is a seasonal river. In Southern California, seasonal rivers only flow when it rains. But when it rains, they have the capacity to flow at a very high level, sometimes in the billions of gallons. I just checked the data this week. Because of the back-to-back atmospheric river systems that we've had, the rivers currently, total river flow for the Tijuana River this past week has been estimated to be at 26 billion gallons of water per day. So it's pretty massive, the amount of water that we're having. I just checked the beach today here in Coronado, and I was telling someone earlier, the plume is impacting us all the way up here. You can see the brown plume coming up the way. This is a picture of right around there is the border line. So obviously there's no infrastructure there because the flow of the river, as I mentioned, is so strong that nothing could potentially stop it unless we built a dam, but that's a different story. So if you can see here, this is one of the structures that the International Boundary and Water Commission has. It's a soft solution. It's an easy fix for when we have low flow levels of the river. It's basically a dirt berm that can capture some of the lower flows from coming across and redirect it to a pump station that's here that is intended to send it further south so that it doesn't flow south of Imperial Beach and end up impacting us up north. Obviously, that can only be done when the river's at a low level, not when it's flowing at a very high level. So I already mentioned the 2017 sewage spill. This is just a picture of all the tributaries that are coming into the river system, and all that means is, if you can imagine, this is an artery, right? And these are little ventricles that are coming through. So it's all coming into the system to, that exacerbates the river pollution. So what are the efforts that have taken place? There's been a lot of work around this, especially in the last 10 years. Under Mayor Dedina's leadership and Mayor Bailey's leadership, we've had a tremendous and mighty coalition that came together of regional stakeholders. The city of Coronado, the city of Chula Vista, the Port of San Diego, National City, everybody came together to advocate not just for solutions, but also for more funding. In the past, we didn't have significant funding come to address some of this crisis. And in fact, the International Boundary and Water Commission, we would meet with them constantly over years and years, and they would say, well, it's not our responsibility because the point source of the pollution isn't being generated by us. And that's true. But at the end of the day, the point source of pollution is coming from across the border and was flowing through their jurisdiction and their property. So therefore, they had a responsibility to meet Clean Water Act standards for our federal law. So that took us to, and this is just there's a lot of other stakeholders that were part of the coalition that we helped build. I forgot to mention even state land, state water board, the Navy, Border Patrol was a big partner in advocating for solutions. They actually now have to receive hazardous pay because despite the fact that they are not going into the water, remember those tributaries that I showed you? Those are the areas that they monitor. And the pollution is so concentrated that they have to walk around or breathe in that some of them have been injured, like developed rashes or asthmatic attacks or even chemical burns on their boots. So now they're receiving hazardous pay. So again, an issue that is affecting multiple agencies and stakeholders, not just the community here. So an approach that we took in the city of Imperial Beach, was complementary to the approach that the city of Coronado took. We took the litigation route. The city of Coronado supported us through lobbyists in DC. So we were basically hitting the federal government on all angles. And what it resulted in was a pretty historic allocation of funding to expand the International Wastewater Treatment Plant that is managed by IBWC with $300 million that were allocated in, I think it's now 2.5 years. Recently, we reached a settlement because we had a very strong case. In fact, it's a precedent-setting case that is now being studied, case studies nationally. Now, IBWC has agreed to a list of actions that they need to commit to, including, notification for where there's a sewage spill. They can't, wash their hands and say, no, well, we're not going to communicate with agencies in Tijuana. They have to communicate with agencies in Tijuana. They have to build that berm that I showed you every time that they can when the river is at a lower level. They have to build that berm every time they can. And with the $300 million that our congressional delegation secured, it is now being managed by the US EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and it's going towards the comprehensive solution that is the result of years and years of all of these stakeholders coming together and having a list of options, and this is the one that everyone has agreed to, which is basically expand the current treatment capacity of the international treatment plant from 25 million gallons per day to 60 million gallons per day. That's going to mean a significant reduction in our beach closure days. So it's going to potentially reduce our beach closure days by 60% when we have wet weather. Repair and engineer circuit. So those are just some of the other things that the comprehensive solution includes, but the most important one for us is expanding the capacity of the international wastewater treatment plant. So these are just some of the policy solutions that we've also identified. There are other sources of funding that should be explored, and next month there's an annual delegation trip that the San Diego Regional Chamber of Commerce always puts together, and that a lot of elected officials of us attend. We go to DC to advocate for more funding for some of these programs. So that's something that we're pushing for every single year. Obviously, $300 million is a drop in the bucket, right? If we really were to implement the entire comprehensive solution, it would take upwards of $600 million. But in the grand scheme of things, there's so much more money that's being utilized to address some of the other issues in our nation. So I would encourage everyone in this room that if you can reach out to your U.S. representative and advocate for more funding, because, and I'll get into the impacts of what this sewage crisis is costing us, right? I'll say that in a moment. But I did want to point out a huge component of this equation that has nothing to do when there's rain, when it's a wet weather or where there's rain events, and that's the infamous San Antonio de los Buenos sewage treatment plant, or commonly known as Punta Bandera. I see some heads nodding. Who's heard of Punta Bandera? Yeah. So Punta Bandera is a dilapidated sewage. I don't even want to call it a sewage treatment plant. I've honestly visited it, and it has technology from the 1950s. And it's basically 3 lagoons that were meant to treat sewage at a primary level. And all that means is that, okay, it'll be at least clean enough so that it could be discharged into the ocean. It's not. And it's discharging undertreated and raw sewage at the rate of 40 million gallons of sewage per day. And it's being discharged just north of Rosarito, so between Tijuana and Rosarito. So if you ever go to that area, you'll probably smell it because it's literally a river of brown water coming out. And so during the winter time, we usually have storm systems that generate currents north to south, right? So that's a plus for us because all of that pollution is going south. But in the summertime, we have systems pushing currents and swells from south to north. So all of these 40 million gallons of sewage are flowing up the coast, potentially impacting even Coronado, as far up as Coronado, during the summer months. So what we want to do is completely eliminate this and construct an entire new sewage treatment plant. And that's something that I've been advocating for years and years and years, and have past government administrations of the state of Baja California, we've had plenty of meetings, plenty of promises that did not come to realization. So my number one priority as mayor is with the current governor of the state of Baja California to reach, to have a meeting where we can really put pen to paper and discuss what are her next steps so that we could get that treatment plant built. So here I just wanted to highlight some of the funding that's come along. Did you all hear that we had a U.S.-Mexico agreement signed? Who's show of hands? Okay, so last August, the United States and the country of Mexico came together and signed a memorandum of understanding committing to funding. So on our behalf, obviously, we had those $300 million that we helped secure. Mexico committed $144 million to help fix their infrastructure. So that's going to be the tool in the toolbox that I will utilize to work with the governor of Baja California so that we can make sure that that funding is invested in the Punta Bandera treatment plant in the next 2 years, which is the 2 years she has remaining in her administration. And I already went over this. That's just a picture. Oh, that's a picture. That's a picture of the discharge. That's literally every day. Every day. That's just the beach is right here. It's a cobblestone beach. Yeah. And you know, the points that I want to highlight with her are that, you know, it's not just affecting us in the United States, it's also affecting her constituents, you know, people who live in Playas, people who live in Rosarito. We have a very large expat community in Baja California. I think it's 44,000 residents there that are all being impacted. There's so much economic loss by not investing money in this treatment plant. So we're hoping that the administration will prioritize that. And just to give you an example of how bad the crisis has gotten, even though we've made this significant progress with the funding, with the new agreement, with the commitments from Mexico, it's without a doubt, the sewage crisis is the worst it's ever been. It really is. And I think it's because of a number of reasons. One is the increased rainfall that we've had in our region. Two, our housing crisis in California is pushing people to go live in Tijuana because obviously, you know, cost of living housing is a lot less expensive. That's all creating added pressure to the sewage system in Tijuana that is not being upgraded. So imagine you have infrastructure from the 50s, and then you have the city of Tijuana at about 2.5 million, and then you have that growing exponentially and all these development projects. If you look south, you'll see all these new towers that just went up, buildings and buildings and buildings that are not adding anything to the sewage system. So it's just creating more pressure on the system, which is in turn causing more sewage spills. Just wanted to give you an example of how many days our beach has been closed. Our beach has been closed the entirety of this year alone at Ivy Pier. So I know that's you've had a significant increase in beach closures here in Coronado as well. So briefly wanted to just touch on the new county Department of Environmental Health water quality monitoring program. In the past, it was culture-based, and you know, we would find out a day after that we had been surfing or bathing in polluted water, right? Because the old type of testing took 24 to 48 hours to produce results. Something that my predecessor, Mayor Dedina, and myself advocated for a long time is, well, why can't we have faster testing? So the EPA, SCORP, which is a regional, body of scientists, and the Department of Environmental Health for the county, and the State California Department of Public Health all came together and created a pilot project which utilizes now DNA type testing. Don't ask me the specifics because over my head how that was developed, but the consensus came to be that this could be a stronger type of testing that we could receive results within 4 to 6 hours. So based on that, the county developed some new signage, which I know has been a little bit, it's been quite confusing for some members of our community. And I won't go into that because obviously there's a lot of community outreach and education that needs to take place from the county on the signage. But my belief is without a doubt that, you know, we do have the strongest water quality monitoring program in the nation, but it's not perfect. And Mayor Bailey and I recently met to talk about that and talk about some adjustments that could be made so that thresholds for South Bay aren't as high as other beaches that are not comparable to us, like La Jolla. La Jolla has pristine water, right? And, you know, other beaches, Blacks, or further north, they shouldn't have the same thresholds as we do because obviously we have an ongoing source of pollution to our beaches. So that's something that we're going to be working on. And I think that's it. How am I doing on time?
You're doing well.
Okay. Okay, so we'll open it up for some questions.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting, your program. I wanted to ask, with all the new towers and things going up in Tijuana, what about permits? Aren't they obligated to help with the infrastructure as we are here?
That is a great question. Thank you for raising that. So that's been a point of concern, I know, for a lot of nonprofits in Tijuana, that there's no, organized fashion in how the permits are being issued. The permitting is issued by the local municipality. The sewage infrastructure is managed by the state agency. And it seems like the permitting is not being compatible with the infrastructure needs or resources that are available. So the other challenge to that is that the local municipal administrations have a high turnover rate. They're only 3 years long. So every time there's a new administration coming in, it's like starting from scratch. So that poses another challenge. It's definitely something that I will be raising with I'm having a meeting in the next couple of weeks with the Secretary for the Environment of the state of Baja California to discuss those nuances and raise those flags, because ultimately they do have impact downstream to us here in Coronado and Imperial Beach. Thank you for that question.
Thank you for your presentation. There has been some mention in some quarters about just building a physical barrier, like 2.5 miles from the shore, straight out into the ocean, at the border, which would present a physical barrier to the flow of sewage north. Any thought to
Thoughts
that?
on that? I think the water would still have the ability to.
Apparently, the theory is that the dilution factor would be such that it would be going out so far, and that's the problem that we have now, is because of the lack of dilution, we're so close. But because it's going out so far, then the dilution would allow it to be safe.
Yeah, and I didn't mention that, but Scripps Institution of Oceanography did a dilution study on the nearshore dynamics of the pollution being emitted by Punta Bandera. That would be a good question to ask them. I wanted to also mention that I'm hosting a council workshop on water quality, and we will have the Department of Environmental Health there and Scripps as well to talk about. That could be a great question to ask the researchers, because I'm not an environmental engineer, so I don't know the potential implications of building a wall on the seafloor. I know that the continental shelf there is quite steep, so I don't know if that's even physically feasible. It'd be an interesting question to ask the researchers for sure. And if you don't ask it, I'll ask it.
Thank you so much for being here today. Just a quick comment following off of Howard's comment. So I serve and represent Coronado on the San Diego Metro JPA wastewater group and board, and we toured recently the Point Loma Sewage Treatment Center, which is where 100% of Coronado's sewage is actually treated. It goes across the bay and goes to Point Loma. And one really striking thing about it compared to what you were showing at Punta Bandera is that even our treated sewage goes out from the coast 4.5 miles before it's discharged into the ocean, and that's treated sewage. So I really appreciate your work you're doing with the Punta Bandera station and the government down there, but one thing to keep in mind is, or even I think even before it's treated, if we could just discharge it further out, which would accomplish what Howard's referring to without having to build a really difficult and maybe almost impossible wall at the border. Just something to, I'm sure you already know, but something to keep in mind. And then also I just really wanted to thank you for the one big takeaway I try to give to people is the additional funding that's going to be needed to finish this. As you mentioned, the EPA says at least 600 million. I think it's probably closer to 700 or 800 million. But as you see now, in 2020, we received the 300 million, and it still hasn't really broken ground yet. So if we get 2/3 or halfway there, and then start fundraising, we'll have another decade or 5 years before it's implemented. So hopefully our city can work with yours and try to help get that funding. So,
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
And thank you for your comment. And I wanted to just mention that there was a delay in implementing the allocated funding. There was a legislative fix. I think there was what the argument was IBWC can't give money to EPA, so they had to do a legislative fix, which they did in December, and now it's moving forward. They're going through the NEPA process, which is a public outreach process. They've concluded that, and next it's the design and review phase of the actual expansion. And then my expectation from what I've had conversations with EPA is that there'll be shovels in the ground in the next 2 years. Now, to your point about the discharge offshore, our Clean Water Act requires that, it's called the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES permit, that any treatment plant in the United States has to discharge 3 miles offshore. The equivalent Clean Water Act for Mexico doesn't require that. It only requires them to discharge at the coastline. It's definitely something that I could raise with them, right? But we can't, compel a different nation to change their laws. But nonprofits can, and I do have close relationships with some of those nonprofits that are advocating for things like that. Yes.
Thank you for the detail in that presentation, Mayor. When you showed the list of entities involved in this problem, one of the bubbles was the Navy. And I know from one of our Congress members in the past that they've had some difficulty getting the Navy to acknowledge that it is a problem for them. Are we past that point? Are they now saying that it affects training, or are they still able to say that they can compensate?
I don't know if they have publicly made those statements. We know by anecdotal reports from ex-Navy SEALs that they have received injuries related to exposure to the polluted water. This upcoming trip with the Chamber delegation to DC, that is actually one of the things that I'm going to, I haven't yet, but I will try to secure a meeting with the Navy, even if it's an informal way, so that they can help us advocate, even if they don't do it in a public way, because I totally understand the implications to our national security related to our Navy SEAL training, right? We don't want our Navy SEALs, we don't want it to be known that our Navy SEALs are exposed to, potentially life-threatening diseases, but that's the case, and I think that might be the resistance. But I am definitely seeking to have a sit-down meeting with Navy officials, high Navy officials in DC to discuss that. Thank you. Yes.
Right. Thank you, Mayor, for bringing up the pollution part to us in Coronado. What about the infrastructure? $2 trillion that we just passed last year, some of which came to California. I haven't heard much about what Newsom is doing about this, nor have I heard anything about the infrastructure money that might be available, and particularly working with them. So as I see it, I don't think we can wait on Mexico to do this. They're not going to. We can do all we want to do at our border, but if they don't stop that sewage jumping into the coast, it's still coming up.
Yeah,
without some kind of barrier that would cost $1 billion. So I think we need, that's something also should be pursued, is the monies from that we need, and also assisting Tijuana in building that, maybe in a joint funding.
Great point, and there is a joint program. It's called the Border Wastewater Infrastructure Program, which is a program that is matched by Mexico 2 to 1. So every dollar that the U.S. spends, $2 is spent in Mexico, and it's intended to go to infrastructure that needs repair that would potentially, if it failed, had impacts to the U.S. So that's a program that is under the EPA that has, I think it's been around for 15 years. At some point it was zeroed out. Last 2 years it's been increased to 100 million. It's for the entire border from here to Texas. So that's another way, and that's a great point, because there are some of these efforts that are being done by nationally. To your point about the infrastructure, I think it's the Inflation Reduction Act, and where we had some infrastructure bill funding. Definitely that's something that we're going to see, how can we get some of that additional funding. We cannot wait for Mexico to fix this. And the ironic thing is that the $300 million was our response to, we won't wait for Mexico. We need to take care of what we can and control, which is our infrastructure on our side. But the state could be doing a lot more for us. And that is, it was very disappointing to have Governor Newsom veto the $100 million legislation that was intended for the Tijuana River and the New River last year. So I've met already with our local state representatives, Senator Steve Padilla and Senator Assembly Member David Alvarez, to discuss how can the state provide more funding for us and maybe do a match of what we've been able to secure at the federal level as well. They could absolutely have a more significant role in this equation. Okay, I see you looking at her, so thank you.